Welcome to the Personality Couch podcast, where we discuss all things personality and clinical practice. I'm your host, Doc Bach, and I'm here with my co-host, Doc Fish. We're both licensed clinical psychologists in private practice, and today we'll be talking about more personality flavors and typologies. In particular, our earliest clinical terms before we had the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or DSM, that we use today. So let's go back to the psychoanalytic language that describes more personality flavors. Let's find out more. Doc Fish and I like to think of personality types like flavors of ice cream. The possibilities are endless. Some of our earliest flavors are especially unique. In particular, the ones that followed a psychodynamic or psychoanalytic tradition. By focusing on the unconscious drives, desires, and the past, these terms are multidimensional compared to the DSM language we often use. Okay. So Doc Fish, this is totally in your wheelhouse as a psychodynamic clinician. What is multidimensional about these flavors in comparison to the DSM listing of personality disorders?
Yeah, so in the DSM, we have a category. So we have one axis. I'm going to name it the character axis. So that's the different categories of the different personalities. Or for ice cream, right? It's the actual flavoring of the personalities. It's the actual flavor of the ice cream. But then we have two other ones in psychoanalysis, psychodynamic. So we have an organizational axis, which is kind of like a state change, right? So like, is the ice cream melting? Is it frozen? Is it just already melted? Like what's happening with the state of the ice cream?
Ooh.
And then we have a severity axis, which is like the amount of ingredients and the ratio. So we can talk about these more in personality terms. Let's start maybe with the severity axis.
Yeah.
What do you know about that one?
Okay, so severity axis is going to be a continuum of like, is this just a personality kind of style? Or is this all the way through to disorder level? Like, are these traits of this person no longer serving them? They're actually working against them, keeping them from functioning in society, from joining the social herd. And kind of everything along that continuum of like, this is just kind of your personality structure, style, type, disorder. That's my understanding, but tell me what you know.
Sure. Right. So like you said, it's a continuum. On that continuum, on that axis, we have the structure, which is everyone has a personality structure. We all have personality. And then if we go to the extreme end of the continuum, we're going to be in that categorical place that we say this is a disorder. Within the disorder piece, you can be more extreme or more disintegrated in the disorder space too.
Wow.
So we can think about it like maybe how many scoops of ice cream you have in your container, right? Do you have just enough, right? Like, are you full? Is your container stable or good? Or is it overflowing? Or is there not enough? Do we have empty spots? Do we have an empty space?
Interesting. This is deep. This is really deep.
It is. Too much flavor, right? Or too much. It's just a difference of ratio, right? If you've ever licked the vanilla extract, that's disgusting.
That's too much. Yeah.
It's too much. It's so gross. But like when you put it in the things it's supposed to go in at the right amount, it's perfect.
Yeah.
So good.
It enhances flavor appropriately.
Right. So that's kind of how I think of that continuum, that first axis of severity.
Okay. What's next?
Yes. So then we have the organization axis. So this is the one where I said about the state change. Little nugget of history. When we were first figuring out terms to utilize to describe mental illness, we had a psychotic level and a neurotic level. And it was just two categories. Eventually, we added a borderline level, or the space in between those. Today, we can utilize this axis as, I'm going to do a vertical axis. So at the top, we have neurotic. At the bottom, we have the psychotic. And then in the middle, right, it's a movement. We can move along that axis. It's not static. It's not necessarily something that will stay the same throughout the lifespan either. We can kind of, even if we're healthy, we can have little snippets where we fall or we move a little bit.
Okay. So like a measure of health, an axis of health.
Yeah.
Okay.
At the same time, just like averages, if we're too extreme, that's when we're starting to have problems. We have the neurotic level. That's going to be like frozen ice cream, like a freezer burnt ice cream. Like it's too frozen. It's ice. It's not ice cream anymore.
Too much. Too rigid.
Yeah. Yes. Too rigid.
Which fits with neurosis.
At the bottom level, we have psychotic, which we're not in touch with reality. So that would be like our ice cream's melted. Like it's liquid. It's no longer the state it's supposed to be in.
Right. No longer really ice cream. It's lost its reality.
It's lost. In that big borderline space between them, we have like the melting process, right? Are we starting to melt? Because we're still ice cream, but we're disintegrating, like we're falling apart.
Wow. So there's a movement.
Yes. If we start moving up, it's like ice cream's getting too hard. Can't scoop it out. Like it's starting to be a little bit painful to scoop out. And then we start moving into that neurotic and we're going to start being like ice. We have that vertical axis. We have the severity axis. Then we have the actual categories. That's going to be an axis, but there's categories. It's not necessarily a continual axis.
So this is where it's more similar to the DSM with categories. So some of these names are the same, some are a little different, but the main difference with psychodynamic or psychoanalytic is these other axes of understanding personality. Like how severe is it? How much is it interfering with their functioning into the social world that we live in? But then also the healthiness of the person, or how integrated or disintegrated they are. So meaning, like you said, what state of the ice cream are we in? Are we freezer burned? Are we just ice, no longer ice cream? Or are we melting in that movement process? Are we melted? And how much do each of those states affect the ability to appropriately socialize? Are we actually at disorder level that it potentially would meet diagnostic criteria for, or is it just, a style or a tendency?
Because then we have even some categories of personality are more prone to being at certain levels of organization.
Ooh,
so
say more.
Let's do obsessive compulsive personality disorder. They're going to be more neurotic.
Of course, yeah.
They're going to be frozen, right? They're rigid. They need to have all of the things together, just like ice. Paranoid may be more in the psychotic level because they can be in touch with or out of touch with reality.
Because that paranoia can kind of lead to a slow fade into maybe even delusional thinking, which is out of touch with reality.
It's not a set thing, right? It's just some categories are more prone to certain levels.
Got it. Got it. So it's not like every time that someone has this personality disorder as characterized in the DSM, that they're always going to be prone to psychosis or borderline, or it's not that.
Yeah.
Of course, it's not that simple.
It can't be. So we were saying how the DSM and the categories that we're going to be talking about are this very similar.
Sure.
So just to name a few, right? Like narcissistic, paranoid, histrionic, obsessive compulsive. Those are the same in psychodynamic and the DSM language. So nothing really new there. So we have antisocial, which is also called psychopathic in psychodynamic language. That encompasses the sadistic piece that the DSM also encompasses. But then we have Millon, who parsed that out as a separate thing. So same wavelength, maybe. Like maybe just different colors of really, really dark gray blacks.
Right.
So that's really the only difference with that piece. Schizoid in the psychodynamic model, has some significant differences.
Really?
It does. So schizoid in the DSM is like a detachment, like no interest in relationships, people. The psychodynamic understanding of schizoid adds in a piece where there's a lot of emotion and a desire for relationship. It's just like turtled in and it's not let out. So there's intense emotions. There's actually too much emotion. Schizoids are too sensitive.
Okay.
Whereas I think the DSM is only capturing the outside piece of that, where it's like, well, they're not making facial expressions, so they must not have the emotion, or they're not attempting to engage in relationships, so they may not want it.
Right. But really, it's they're overwhelmed with the schizoid, according to the psychoanalytic tradition, is that they're overwhelmed by all the input coming in, the emotions, versus DSM doesn't capture maybe the why.
I think that's it. Yep. It doesn't necessarily capture the why. It's a bigger category. So the DSM schizotypal is going to also fall in the psychodynamic schizoid category.
Interesting.
So there's no separate category for that. And avoidant from the DSM, that could actually fall under the schizoid. So it seems like a bigger category in psychodynamic, and it has more emotionality, and it's like just a little bit more complex. It's heavier, meatier.
Right. And of course, you have the two other axes of severity and organization or disintegration that you also have to look at within each one of these categories, which is missing. That dimensional piece is missing from the DSM. Exactly.
A great example for that, if we were to, I guess, have a category, a continuum for it, I think Nancy McWilliams, in her description of it, says schizoid can range anywhere from an eccentric genius all the way down to like the schizoid structure. And then we have the schizotypal, because we're in and out of reality, borderline level. Then also schizophrenia, of being completely out of reality at the psychotic level, right? We're out of reality.
Sure. And skis means
split,
right?
Yes.
So split from other people or from affect. And that can really be a range, as you're saying, from like someone who just prefers to keep to themselves and is kind of split from the emotional stimuli that's too much,
Right.
to like that borderline level of disintegration, where it's like one chosen reality and one's out, which is more of a schizotypal, what the DSM calls schizotypal. And then all the way through to the psychotic end, which is more schizophrenia, out of touch with reality, complete disconnect with emotions. There's flat emotional affect or display of emotions, disconnect from people.
I think the skis in general, so schizotypal, schizoids, even schizophrenia, which is not a personality disorder, but it's still skis related. I think they're analyzed and categorized in a way that is a disservice because it's only one face. And in the inner world, because it's split, right? Because skis split from their own needs and from the world, they're not seen. They're not seen as deeply as, I don't know, a histrionic, because they want to be seen.
Right. Because if you have one personality type that's more dramatic, of course, the one that's more dramatic, overt, is going to be seen or get attention, versus someone with a skis or schizoid just structure, not at disorder level, not at psychotic or borderline level, like just kind of your typical schizoid structure might be overlooked or even over pathologized or mislabeled because there's a disconnect from the social world, but it's not necessarily interfering with their ability to go about life,
right,
as it would with other disorders.
And because of that withdrawal, they're going to be outside of the norms anyway. They're not rejecting of the norms necessarily like an antisocial would be. They just are. They just don't fit.
Yeah.
And what do we do with things that are different? We're scared. We don't want to understand it. We outcast it. And so any kind of skis related disorder is very much likely to be over pathologized.
Because it's different. Okay. So that's schizoid. What else does psychoanalytic tradition have to say about categories?
There's masochistic, which is also named self-defeating for psychodynamic. So that actually matches Millon. It used to be in the DSM in the past, but it is no longer in there. But Millon and psychodynamic still holds on to that. There's nothing added really to this description of it. If you remember in previous episodes, we had said masochistic or the self-defeating is like Ariel and from The Little Mermaid. She chooses to give her voice away.
Right. This is the type that's in the victim role, kind of willfully or willingly puts themselves in that role. Sometimes subconsciously, like they don't even mean to do it, but it's just this constant pattern of putting themselves in harm's way and then not getting the most out of life because they keep cutting themselves short. So this was the temperament that didn't get to enjoy the ice cream because they didn't even make it to the shop.
Right. Exactly. Then we have a very large piece that differs. In psychodynamic, we have the depressive and the manic personalities.
Ooh, what is that?
Yeah, they're paired together because they're essentially a mirror of each other. So depressive is rejecting essentially the high spiritedness of manic, and manic is rejecting of depressive. Inverse.
Okay. So can someone sit in just the depressive space or just the manic space, or is it both? Like, does psychoanalytic tradition say if you're sitting in that structural space personality wise, you're both?
Okay, so you can sit in the depressive and stay there because there's not necessarily a cost of energy. You can't necessarily always sit in hypomanic or the manic states of personality because you will run out of energy. You're going to crash at some points and you're going to fall into that depressive state. Now, I would also say it's fair that the depressive personalities do have some good days, right? But it's still not going to be manic all the time. When we were talking about Millon has a term he named turbulent. So those ups and downs, that's going to fit with that manic personality and psychodynamic.
Okay. So that was the one that liked to ride the roller coaster.
Yeah.
I like the highs and I want to experience all of life, like put more on the plate, high-spirited, high energy, seeking out opportunities.
Which is not the bipolar manic, which is so hard because the words are literally the same, but they mean something different. The bipolar manic, they're going to be tossed on that roller coaster essentially against their will. So that's a manic. The other piece of the manic that can occur is cyclophrenic.
Ooh.
And we use that word. I actually am going to prefer to use that word in this case because in the DSM, this is going to capture borderline personality disorder. In psychodynamic, we have that level of disintegration or that movement, which is at the borderline level, not disorder category, right? So now we have two words that mean something different again.
Oh, wow.
So cyclophrenic is going to be that movement or cycling. So we'll be in that movement of ups and downs, very similar to turbulent.
Interesting.
Yes. So Millon also had that term for borderline personality disorder. So that's similar to manic and psychodynamic.
Oh my goodness.
I know.
So borderline, what we know is borderline today, borderline personality disorder, previously was cyclophrenic.
Correct.
And so what we're saying is within psychoanalytic tradition, you can have someone with who's cyclophrenic in personality structure and potentially disintegrated to the borderline level. Right. So essentially it's like a borderline structure with a borderline level of disintegration. Okay.
Yeah.
What does that look like? What is borderline with borderline?
Okay. So brief summary. Essentially, when the DSM was created, we attempted to fit a borderline level so that all that space in between neurotic and psychotic, we tried to fit that whole category or that whole movement into a category.
Gosh.
And we named it borderline personality disorder. Now, if you really explore that as a category, you're actually going to see more of the dependent flavors, the histrionic flavors. It's a mix. It's the only personality category we have that really, it's a movement. That's why no borderline is going to look the same at all, according to the DSM.
Okay.
That's what happens. So if we have a borderline personality disorder diagnosed with the DSM, and if we're using our thinking of neurotic, psychotic, and in that middle borderline, that borderline personality disorder at the borderline level is going to look like somebody who is going to like disintegrate out of reality. So they might have dissociation, paranoid ideations, the transient stress reactions that are part of borderline, sure.
Yeah.
Right. But it's going to be like sticking your toes in that psychotic state. Does that make sense? It's like the movement within a category, and they have the same name.
So we really mess things up with the categorization in the DSM-3 and beyond, where we lumped things together because to talk about things just like the ice cream. Like, what state is the ice cream in? Is it ice cream? Is it melting? Is it frozen and freezer burned? Is it melted? We took the melting process, and made it a categorical diagnosis in the DSM, saying this is melting. So basically, borderline personality disorder is saying this personality is melting.
Right. But all the other categories are flavors.
Right.
So if we use that, borderline category could be dependent, the cookies and cream. Maybe it has some avoidant flavors. So maybe it's cookies and cream with like cookie dough pieces in it. Mm-hmm. Maybe we have some other flavor. Like, it's not its own flavor. That's why we also use chocolate and vanilla for the borderline, because it's a base.
Yeah.
It's a base, and there's lots of things thrown in.
Yeah. It can look like so many different things, and the health level too. So not just the disintegration of like neurotic to psychotic, but also how healthy is this person, and how much is this interfering with their ability to function in society.
Exactly.
Like, yet another axis. So we tried to simplify things a little too much with the DSM, it sounds like. However, it's helpful to be able to understand it in kind of bite-sized chunks, because this gets into complex stuff, but it's more descriptive in making sense of all the nuances of personality.
Absolutely.
So cyclophrenic, we were talking about cyclophrenic and then manic and depressive.
Right. So that's the manic piece, and then the depressive piece. In psychodynamic, there's two differences. There's an introjective depressive personality, and there's an anaclitic depressive personality. So introjective is going to be internalizing into you something that someone else has given you, and it's going to be, I'm bad. So if that's what you're hearing mom say, or your primary attachment figure, now you've taken that as your own. It's introjected into you.
Right.
And that's what you're feeling. I'm bad.
It's like baked into the cookie.
Baked into the cookie.
Yep.
This is going to match with Millon's melancholic, the Eeyore. There's also previously in the DSM, there was a depressive personality disorder that was in an appendix. It didn't quite make it. It was there for a little bit, but it didn't quite make it.
Right. Like, we weren't able to make the diagnosis with it, but it was there kind of to consider, and then was chucked out. Unfortunately. Yeah.
So then the other piece of the depressive is going to be the anaclitic depressive. That is going to be more of like an emptiness, an empty depression. Like, I'm lonely. I want connections. I'm empty. I'm feeling hungry, essentially. I need to fill up. I need somebody else. So that's going to match the dependent personality in both Millon and DSM.
Okay. So different types of depression. So one of them is this core belief that's perhaps an internalized experience from early attachment, from early childhood, from a caregiver, that I am bad. And so then I deserve bad things that come to me. And kind of there's this reinforcing cycle. And then there's the other type of depressive, the anaclitic, which is, it sounds like there's a bit of a void that needs to be filled by something else. Like someone else needs to fill the void, or something else needs to.
Yeah. And that's when you're looking outside of yourself and you need to cling on to someone else to feel okay, which is the dependent piece. So here's a great example of we can have the dependent personality disorder at the borderline level of organization. And that usually can present in the DSM category as a borderline personality disorder.
Yes.
It's
And
like a disintegrated dependent.
right. And that's what kind of collectively, culturally, we've been calling quiet borderline.
Yes, which we're going to talk about in the future.
Yeah. Not today. There's plenty to talk about today, but a later time.
Yes. But it's so interesting. And it does get confusing because we use the same words to describe different concepts. At the same time, it expands how we think of things, right? So we've been saying the DSM is not perfect for categorizing personality or describing it, obviously.
For sure.
Neither is Millon's. Neither is psychodynamic. Personality and human beings in general are so complex. It's just helpful to use all the languages to have a deeper understanding.
Right. It's like we need to look at all the different flavor possibilities with personality, because if every single one of us is like a walking ice cream cone with whatever flavor, each one of us is going to be different. Like there's going to be a lot of similarities, like vanilla or chocolate, but then all the mix-ins and flavors you can put with that, it's vastly different from one person to the next.
Absolutely.
What else? Are there other differences, different things with psychoanalytic?
There is negativistic personality disorder or personality at the disorder level in Millon. That exists in Millon. It doesn't exist in the DSM. Doesn't exist in psychodynamic. So we don't know where that is. We paired everything else up, but negativistic isn't in psychodynamic. But then we have dissociative. That's going to address previously multiple personality disorder, literally a personality thing, right?
Right.
But in the DSM, it was changed to dissociative identity disorder. It was kind of taken out of that personality, given its own section. And now here in this podcast, we're not going to talk about it often because it's no longer part of that personality piece. But we can say that dissociation can be a huge part of a fractured sense of self with different personality traits.
Yeah. And what does dissociation mean? What does that look like?
Yeah. So that is going to be essentially like a withdrawal of either emotions, of thoughts. It's going to be splitting off from something. There's a lot of different forms, actually. Derealization is going to feel like you're not real. Well, depersonalization is where you're feeling like you're not real, like you yourself are not real. Derealization is going to be when your surroundings, your environment doesn't feel real. It's like you're withdrawing into a different reality, maybe. So maybe it would be that transition into the psychotic level.
Maybe it looks a bit more like melting.
Maybe, a little bit.
Okay. I like to think of it as like an altered state of consciousness that, and even at the least severe level, like we all daydream.
Yes.
To some degree, or zone out. But at more severe levels, it can be like actually feeling like you're losing touch with reality or out of body experiences, maybe watching yourself, feeling like you're watching yourself third person. And that can be a way to protect ourselves, certainly if there's been trauma in our lives. But yeah, it sounds like previously this tendency to dissociate, to go to that kind of fuzzy, altered state of consciousness was considered a personality, a way of interacting with the world. Yes.
So I think, and this is my own spin on it, my own understanding, multiple personality disorder, it's a personality disorder. You have multiple whole personalities in one person. But because of that, because one person conceptually should not be more than one person. Mathematically, maybe that doesn't make sense. Now we have the dissociative identity disorder instead, because we have that fractured sense of self, and that's moved out of that personality piece and into something different.
Right. Okay. That it's its own category.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been a shift, I think, in the field in our conceptualization of that, of previously multiple personality disorder. Now it's called dissociative identity. But that's one that I think needs more research, because easily there could be a personality component. Arguably, I would have to think that there is. But
yeah, it doesn't fit neatly. Where it's at, it probably doesn't fit neatly within personality because it's a little bit more complex than just one.
Yeah.
But it's still part of the personality. So that's what happens when we try to fit an entire complex system into squares, categories.
Right. Okay. So are there any others in the psychodynamic, psychoanalytic tradition that are different than DSM?
Not at a level that is worth discussing here. There's always nuances, always little nuances.
Sure.
But overall, they are very similar.
Okay. The structures overall are similar, except for where we talked about it
Exactly.
already. But the biggest difference is that there's multiple axes. So there's the structural organization, and there's kind of the healthy. I like to think of it as the healthiness level. Like, are we at just structure, type, style? Are we at disorder level? How much is this really interfering with my ability to go about the world? And then the organization or disintegration. Where are we at? Are we melting, frozen?
Right.
Yeah, totally different way to think about things. That is pretty stinking complex.
It is. There's beauty in the complexity. There's also maybe a little bit of frustration.
Yeah, because it's a lot. This is why we try to bring in some ice cream to bring some levity to an otherwise complex situation.
Exactly.
Appreciate your expertise as a clinician that practices within this lens. And for those of us who haven't been trained or don't practice in this area, it's so useful to just have different language, different ways to think about things, different like scaffolding and verbiage to help make sense of the world around us. So very, very helpful.
I agree.
All right. Well, that's a wrap for today. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of The Personality Couch. Join us next time as we dive deeper into personality disorders, as well as different personality types and structures. Be well, be kind, and we'll see you next time on The Personality Couch. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute a professional relationship. If you're in need of professional help, please seek out appropriate resources in your area. Information about clinical trends or diagnoses are discussed in broad and universal terms and do not refer to any specific person or case.